Okay, our next question. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between training for raw competition or for geared competition. And I don't want to put Matt on the spot by having to go first all the time, so we'll start with Dave and work our way over to you.
Oh, God, is this going to be an answer or a rant?
2 minutes, go.
Fuck. I mean, one of the questions that I get everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, fucking everywhere. First off, why don't you have any raw lifters on the site? Well, we do. You know, they lift raw and they lift with gear. They do both. So that's why they're already there. You know what I'm saying? I mean, most of you guys have done raw meets and you've done gear meets. You know, they want straight raw people. Well, maybe I want straight gear people too. How come I can't get somebody who just lifts in gear but never does a raw meet? I can't find those fuckers either. So there's my first point. Just training is training, guys. This is what I don't understand. I mean, it's strength training. The way that you're going to develop your program and the way that you're going to develop the training cycle going into the meet, you know, albeit, you know, some kind of conjugate method or a block method or just a linear method. Strength is strength. You're going to develop your strength using the same basic type of protocols that you would regardless if you wore triple ply, single ply, or raw. There's no fucking difference in the training. I don't get that. You know, you're just driving a different car. Granted, you're going to need to get training sessions and repetitions in your gear, you know, before the meet goes. But that is such, when you look at the total workload of a training session and what happens in that session, and you look at it over the course of the full training cycle, the amount of work that's actually being done in gear is very, very small. 20% probably at best of the total repetitions out of everything somebody does in their training. I'm not just talking the squat, I'm talking squat, deadlift, bench, accessories, warm-ups, all that other kind of stuff. You might end up with 4 or 5 reps in full gear, you know, towards the later end of the training cycle, but you got hundreds of repetitions that were done raw. So there is no difference. Programming is programming. You just need to make sure that the gear fits. You need to make sure that you utilize it so you know how to use it, which I'll let these guys speak upon. But as far as the general programming goes, very, very little has to go into that. To flip the question back, I'm still looking for the program online that's for geared only. You know, I can't find a for geared only 12-week training cycle or a multiply only bench training cycle. Or fuck, as far as that goes, I can't find a loaded to the gill on every drug possible training cycle for 12 weeks. I just find training cycles. So all training cycles got to be modified based upon who the individual is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and of course their gear is going to be in there to some degree. But you don't have to have a whole new program just because you're raw. You guys that have gone raw and have gone in geared as well and have done both, look at their training logs and they'll tell you only a few things change and it's not that much. And we got some people that do compete Cal's law, raw, multiply, single ply. Who knows what his next meet's going to be with him? You know, his training doesn't change. It's just a couple little tiny aspects do. It's just whatever. Go on. It blows my mind.
I can't really follow that.
It's ridiculous. Like a receiver has to. It's whatever.
The biggest thing I would say, if I had to nitpick, would be, you know, when I'm programming for someone who's raw, or, you know, versus a equipped lifter, would be the amount of reps. I'd have the guy lifting raw doing, you know, more of sets of 5s, you know, at the start. Whereas in equipment, you know, I usually don't have people do that. They'll start with triples or doubles or whatever. That's just my, you know, take on that. The assistant's going to be basically the same with some small changes with the way the gear carries over. You know, it'll make your weak points a little different. You know, with squat, the top end, you have to work more reverse band work. But again, you know, being a raw squatter, you might have top end issues. You need to throw in a lot of chain work, a lot of reverse band, you know, stuff. And the same thing could be said for the bench and the deadlift with top end work. Maybe you have really strong chest, really strong legs, you know, on the deadlift, and you have lockout issues. then you do a lot of top end work, after you work out at the bottom. But it's not going to change very much at all. The difference is that, you might do extra sets as you keep working up in the gear, and then, whereas you might move on to some down sets raw, or move on to the system stuff. But the same thing for both will be always build momentum, moving forward, always be open to, tweaking. You have your set plan for the day, your percentage or whatever. And like Dave says, a good way to look at it. Some people look at 80% of your best regardless to do that day. Maybe sometimes you need to look at more of a perceived effort, 80% of what you think you can do that day. Always building momentum, not missing lifts, in my opinion. I hate missing lifts in training, whether you're raw equipped, off season or whatever, getting smashed by weight. I don't believe in, if you're pushing it that much in training, working up for a meet, I'd always opt to back off before missing a lift. But just always building momentum forward, and it's basically the same, in my opinion.
Yeah, I wouldn't change, in my core training, I wouldn't change a single thing. If I was training for a raw meet versus a geared meet, I wouldn't change a single thing. The only thing that would be absent are the last reps, like Dave said, that would normally be suited. Those obviously would not be there. In my assistance training, like he said, there would obviously be different weaknesses that would pop up when the gear's absent, and I would address those as they appeared in the training. But the training would be absolutely no different, except minus the gear reps at the end. That's it.
Yeah, and actually I was just going to say the same thing. I think that depending on the individual, depending on where they're weak, whether they're raw or equipped, is what you're going to be training at that point in time. So if they are weak off the chest, as a raw lifter is, then you're just going to happen to do more work that's going to build that. So, I mean, just like these guys said, I think we can all agree that doesn't change much. It just depends on the individual and where they are at that time with their strengths and weaknesses. Brian said it, maybe sets and rep, your reps might change a little bit when it comes to some of your main lifts, but other than that, generally speaking, most lifters are going to have the same, the same issues as far as weaknesses and technical points. So
I think, one thing that, especially like geared lifters, your skill work it becomes much more important. Where as a raw lifter, they may go, well, I'm just going to, do my percents or whatever, and they focus less on the skill stuff and focus more on the weight. Where you take somebody who has to do, the gear stuff, it has to be right. If it's raw, if your skill work or your technique is off just a little bit, you're gonna miss or you're gonna get hurt. With the raw stuff, you can get away with it a little more, so that they might not focus on that technique as much, where they need to do that. Or in the case of, say, the conjugate method, you take somebody who's been just doing whatever, and they switch to the conjugate method, and you go, okay, we got to hammer the posterior chain and hamstrings. Well, their hamstrings are here and their quads are here, and they go, we're going to hammer our hamstrings. And they bring their hamstrings to here, and they forget about doing the quad stuff, and their quad stuff comes down here. Where's their squat go? It goes backwards after 4 weeks. And they go, well, the conjugate method sucks. It doesn't work for raw people. Well, they never have enough, they didn't keep their quad stuff high enough, and their hamstrings haven't come up enough to continue to move up. So some of that you have to be a little more patient, and the technique stuff, I think it needs to be reinforced with the raw stuff just as much as the geared lifters.
To circle back, now that I've had some time to digest the question, instead of being thrown right in the fire from the beginning. The point that I was trying to make is there's a lot of assumptions made with gear and with raw lifting. And those assumptions are basically that the geared lifter is always going to miss at the top if it's the bench press or if it's the squat. The raw lifter is always going to miss at the bottom. Let me throw this out just as a case in point. I've been to a lot of geared meets, and most of the times I see people miss the squat, it's because they fall out of the hole when they sit down. I see very few actually squat up and miss the squat. I see some, very, very few. Most of the time where I see people miss the bench with full gear is because they can't touch or they don't have the right positioning out of the bottom. You do see some, not many, that fail at the lockout. Now, with a raw lifter, the assumption's made that generally they're always going to miss off their chest. Well, isn't that what we see with the geared lifting to begin with? With the geared lifting or the raw lifter, the assumption is, well, they're going to miss out of the hole because they don't have the gear to help them. Isn't that the same place where the geared lifting is missing theirs? So where I have a problem with the structured training via gear or raw is because these assumptions are being made, and I'm not a big guy on assumptions when it comes to training. I think the training needs to be specific to the individual who you're working with or the individual who's training for the meet. And as Matt said, it has to be based upon their own sticking points and their own weaknesses. Now, Adam's weakness may be different in gear compared to raw. So he'll need to change the accessories to be able to accommodate that. Brian's the thing, and I think that's kind of the takeaway from what they were saying there. Their own personal sticking points or mini maxes are different based upon if they're raw or geared. That's how it needs to be addressed with anybody. There is no cut and dry example, and I just kind of blew the whole assumption thing completely out of the water, and anybody that's been to a multiply meet or a raw meet is going to sit there and say, yeah, he's absolutely right. This is where people miss. They miss for different reasons, but it's the same place. So that's kind of where my frustration comes from out of the whole thing.